one of the big things, differences between Marxism and postmodernism in their approach to power, is that where Marxism sees power as a force bearing down from above, postmodernism sees power as a grid or as a system that is kind of all-encompassing and emerging from every point, in every part of the grammar of language, in every part of fashion, hairstyles, basically everything. Not only does that mean that you assume power or sort of power structures or oppression to be present and then look for it via criticism rather than sort of finding out if it is there in the first place. It also means that these systems of power can be oppressive without any one villain necessarily being responsible. And it means that our actual conscious views on things are somewhat irrelevant. The authors here referred to postmodernism as being a conspiracy theory without a conspirator. So again, you can see that immediately how that works in modern day activism, where the redefinition of racism as not being something that people do or something that people think. It's they've taken one possible aspect of racism, the systemic aspect, or the systemic results of racist behavior or thought, and defined it so that that is the only possible definition, the only valid definition of racism.
I mean, so much of this is the case because of the postmodernists' stress on the importance of language. Right? If language is the only thing that creates society, then it is desperately important to control language, right? The only way you can change society is by controlling language. And so Lindsay and Pluckrose, Pluckrose and Lindsay, that's the order on the cover. They kind of talk about the policing of speech. And I think they have quite a good explanation for why the policing of speech is so important for postmodernists. And it's exactly for that reason, because everything is constructed through language. And so towards the end of the book, when they talk about social justice pedagogy, it's very important for social justice educators not to allow people to disagree with them in class, because that only allows oppressors to introduce an oppressive discourse in the class, which the whole point of the class is to undermine oppressive discourses. And so not only is freedom of speech, if you will, not a value, it's actually harmful in their view to their political project.
Right. And they cite towards the end of the book, as you say, they cite scholars very explicitly saying, how to deal with people who debate a point in class, and basically saying that they are causing harm. It's causing harm to the other students to even dignify an objection. The only type of disagreement allowed is asking so as to better understand. It's like, and it is like, although I dislike the modern tendency to sort of like pejoratively call things religious all the time, that aspect of it is certainly a kind of a religious dynamic. So there's this idea that, asking for evidence or an argument for a claim is just asking someone to submit to a power structure, because not only specific claims, but specific methodologies have power dynamics embedded in them. So, if I, and listener, there really are people who think this, that, if I ask for scientific evidence of something, that I'm imposing a kind of a Western white colonialist power structure on someone, because, rationality and science is the domain of Western white people. Obviously, it hardly even needs to be said this is like an inherently racist idea. But that is, some people will go that far as to make that claim. So this kind of, we get into the reason this book is titled Cynical Theories, because again, if everything is about power relations, then rather than looking for truth, you have to always read with criticism or deconstruction in mind. You have to be looking to catch someone in a contradiction or to catch someone in a power move of some kind. So we've already been kind of making the connection. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, you mentioned truth, and I think that is a really important concept to kind of pause and think about, at least from the postmodern perspective. Because certainly in the first two phases, so Pluckrose and Lindsay talk about the high deconstructivist phase kind of back in the 60s and the 70s, a little bit into the 80s. Then they have the applied phase in the 80s and in the 90s and kind of into the 2000s. And there's a real cynicism about the existence of truth. In fact, they don't really believe that there is anything that's true per se. There is power. There is the social construction of our world. And so we can say things about how our society works, but something that is like beyond the here and now, something that is deeper, something that is eternal, something that is objective that we might call true, doesn't exist. Or even if it does, we can't say anything about it. We can't access it. They've made the switch now in what Pluckrose and Lindsay call this current phase, right? They call it reified postmodernism, in which postmodernism has become, and I guess I very much chafe against using that word religious too, even though they like to use it, and we'll certainly talk about why they like to do so later. But I would use the word dogmatic. Now all of a sudden, they know exactly what the truth is. What are the groups that exist in society? I'll tell you. Intersectionality tells us what the groups are. Well, how do you know that those are the groups as opposed to some other classification of society? There's no empirical argument. It's just a dogmatic assertion. There's a hierarchy. These people are on top. These people are in the middle. Those people are on the bottom. Well, how do you know that that's the case? It's a dogmatic assertion. Even though the postmodern theories that they often travel under the name studies, blank studies. They tend to be in the academy classified under the social sciences, but they have very, very weak empirical foundations. They're mostly the implications that are drawn out from particular dogmatic foundations, like what are the groups in society? How are they hierarchically ordered? There's a section in the book, and some of the listeners might know this because Robin DiAngelo has been talked about a lot ever since George Floyd was killed back in May in Minneapolis, that you don't ask whether racism happened, you ask how did it manifest itself. You just know that it is always everywhere in every situation. How do you know that? You just do. It's an act of blind faith, we might say.
Right. Yeah. And, to be fair, most religions that have existed involve some kind of irrational assent. So, even though it happens that they're speaking in a Western context where the religion they're rejecting is more or less Christianity, most of the religions that have existed in history have involved these kind of blind assumptions and assertions without evidence. So I suppose in a sense it's fair to use that as a way of describing some of these dynamics.
I mean, a lot of it comes down to the understanding of reason, right? And so certainly the critical theories, or as they call them, the cynical theories of postmodernism, put rationality up as just one way of knowing. There's lots and lots of different ways of knowing, and they're all equal. But what they don't try to do is show how they are all compatible, right? And this is where I think it's radically different from, say, the way that the church talks about rationality, that rationality is one way of knowing. It's not the only way to know, even though Pluckrose and Lindsay, being kind of atheist materialists, say that essentially that's the only way to know, but that all the different ways of knowing are compatible, right? They all reinforce one another. And in postmodernism, there's no attempt to show how things fit together. The celebration of incoherence takes place a lot, and especially in queer theory, that's the point. The point is to destroy the ability to know anything,